In the 16th century, a shocking practice swept across Christian Europe like a spiritual plague. Peasants sold their last coins, nobles mortgaged properties, and even prostitutes offered their bodies in exchange for something invisible: divine forgiveness. What began as a doctrine of mercy had been transformed into the greatest financial scandal in the history of the Church. Pope Leo X, son of the powerful Medici family, watched from his golden palace as coffers overflowed with gold stained by tears. His hands, adorned with papal rings, held reports revealing stunning numbers: millions of florins collected through the systematic sale of paradise. The Vicar of Christ had become the greatest merchant of souls in Christendom. Johann Tetzel, a German Dominican friar, traveled through the cities with the disturbing theatricality. His voice echoed through the squares: the moment the coin touches the bottom of the chest, the soul leaps from purgatory straight to glory. Crowds gathered, desperate to escape the eternal torments that the Church so vividly described. But in the shadows of Wittenberg, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther watched this commercialization with growing horror. His eyes witnessed families becoming impoverished to buy paper certificates that supposedly guaranteed eternal salvation. Indignation boiled in his chest like lava about to explode. If you want to discover how this diabolical practice nearly destroyed the Christian faith and unleashed the greatest religious revolution in history, subscribe to the channel now. This is a journey that will forever change your understanding of power, corruption, and faith. What you are about to discover about indulgences will shock your soul. To understand the magnitude of this scandal, we need to go back to the origins of indulgences in the early church. During the first centuries of Christianity, sinners who committed serious crimes went through long periods of public penance. They fasted for months, wore coarse clothes, and were excluded from communion until they demonstrated genuine repentance. The doctrine of purgatory, gradually developed by the Church, created the fertile ground for what was to come. According to this belief, souls who died in a state of grace, but still had minor sins, went through purification in an intermediate place before reaching heaven. This concept, though not clearly defined in Scripture, became official dogma. In the 11th century, during the Crusades, the Church began offering indulgences to warriors who fought in the Holy Land. Pope Urban II promised complete remission of sins for those who died defending the sacred sites. What began as a military incentive soon expanded to other good works and generous donations. Little by little, the practice became dangerously distorted. Bishops discovered they could raise substantial funds by offering spiritual relief in exchange for financial contributions. What was meant to be an expression of divine mercy turned into a profitable machine that fueled clerical greed. By the 14th century, corruption was so ingrained that popes established special jubilee years where plenary indulgences were openly sold. The Vatican had discovered a spiritual goldmine, and it would not hesitate to exploit it to its catastrophic consequences. Giovanni de' Medici assumed the papacy in 1513 as Leo X, at only 37 years old. Son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, he had been raised amidst the Renaissance luxury of Florence, where art, politics, and money mingled without ceremony. His princely education had not prepared him for spirituality, but rather for business and temporal power. The new pope inherited an indebted Vatican and grandiose architectural projects that constantly drained the papal coffers. St. Peter's Basilica, begun by his predecessor Julius II, consumed astronomical fortunes in its construction. Leo X saw indulgences not just as a source of income, but as the definitive solution to his financial problems. With the commercial cunning typical of the Medicis, Leo X systematized the sale of indulgences as never before in history. He established exclusive territories for sellers, created price tables based on the social status of the buyers, and developed a commission system that encouraged the commercial aggressiveness of his representatives. The Pope even went so far as to create special indulgences for the dead, allowing relatives to buy the release of loved ones from purgatory. This macabre innovation exponentially multiplied profits, as it exploited family love and the guilt of survivors. No human pain was too sacred to be monetized. Documents from the time reveal that Leo X openly treated indulgences as investments. He discussed profit margins with bankers, negotiated exclusive sales contracts in different regions, and personally monitored the financial performance of each campaign. The Vicar of Christ had become the CEO of salvation. Johann Tetzel was the perfect right-hand man for Leo X's schemes. This German Dominican friar possessed a natural talent for persuasion and a conscience apparently impermeable to moral scruples. His reputation as an indulgence salesman was legendary throughout the Germanic region, where his theatrical presentations drew crowds like circus shows. Tetzel developed sales techniques that would be considered revolutionary even by modern marketing standards. He arrived in cities with deliberate pomp, carrying a red cross and papal documents sealed with gold wax. He set up colorful stalls in central squares, where he displayed ornate certificates that supposedly guaranteed a direct passage to paradise. His sermons were true shows of psychological terror. He described in macabre detail the sufferings of purgatory, where the listeners' parents and mothers supposedly agonized in purifying flames. He shouted that every moment of hesitation in buying indulgences prolonged the torture of dead loved ones, burdening the living with unbearable guilt. The friar even developed commercial jingles that stuck in the minds of simple people. His most famous phrase echoed through the German streets like a diabolical mantra: "As soon as the money in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." This catchy rhyme transformed eternal salvation into an instant commercial transaction. Tetzel spared no one, not even the poorest. He created installment payment plans, accepted domestic animals as part of the payment, and even received sexual favors from desperate women. For him, every form of human suffering was merely a business opportunity waiting to be exploited. The indulgence sales operation had become a highly organized multinational enterprise. Leo X established a distribution network that extended throughout Europe, with exclusive territories, sales quotas, and accountability systems that rivaled the most sophisticated commercial organizations of the time. Each region had a papal commissioner responsible for overseeing sales and ensuring that Rome received its share of the profits. These men, usually ambitious bishops or abbots, received generous percentages of the revenue, creating an army of motivated sellers who did not hesitate to exploit the spiritual vulnerability of the masses. The pricing system was carefully structured to maximize profits. Kings and emperors paid thousands of florins for plenary indulgences, while prosperous merchants shelled out hundreds. Even poor peasants had affordable options, ensuring that no social class escaped the papal commercial network. Leo X even created different types of indulgences for various situations and budgets. There were certificates for past sins, insurance against future sins, and even family policies covering spouses and children. Papal commercial creativity seemed to have no limits when it came to monetizing spiritual fear. Vatican financial records show that, in some years, indulgences accounted for more than 50% of all papal revenue. This economic dependence created a vicious cycle. The more the church depended on this dirty money, the more aggressively it needed to sell salvation to maintain its luxurious standard of living. The human consequences of this commercialization of faith were devastating throughout Europe. Entire families were impoverished to buy paper certificates that promised eternal relief for deceased relatives. Peasants sold their few animals, artisans mortgaged their tools, and even children handed over their childhood savings to the papal coffers. In Germany, a widow named Marguerite sold her only dairy cow to buy an indulgence that supposedly would free her dead husband from purgatory. For months, she and her 3 small children starved, surviving only on water and scraps of bread she could beg. Her desperate faith had blinded her to the reality of her situation. Heinrich, a shoemaker from Augsburg, spent the entire inheritance he planned to leave his children on buying indulgences for the whole family. He sincerely believed he was investing in the eternal salvation of all his loved ones. When he died in misery, his children inherited only debts and papal certificates of no practical value. Local churches were transformed into aggressive sales points, where priests abandoned their pastoral duties to become commissioned salesmen. Sunday sermons were replaced by commercial presentations that exploited guilt, fear, and family love to extract money from the most vulnerable faithful. Documents from the time describe disturbing scenes: sick elderly people spending their last coins on indulgences, prostitutes offering their bodies in exchange for papal forgiveness, and even criminals thinking they could buy the right to continue sinning. Corruption had contaminated every aspect of European spiritual life. While Leo X celebrated his extraordinary profits and Tetzel continued his lucrative tour of Germany, a silent opposition grew among more conscientious clergy. Many priests and bishops began to secretly question whether the church had completely lost its soul in exchange for gold and temporal power. Martin Luther, the Augustinian monk of Wittenberg, watched with increasing horror the parade of impoverished peasants who arrived in his city carrying indulgence certificates bought from Tetzel. These poor souls sincerely believed they had secured their eternal salvation through commercial transactions with papal representatives. What most disturbed Luther was not just the financial extortion, but the fundamental distortion of the gospel that it represented. Christ's message of free grace and unconditional love had been transformed into a system of payment for spiritual services. Salvation, which should be a divine gift, had become a papal commodity. In his nocturnal reflections, Luther studied the scriptures looking for any biblical basis for the sale of indulgences. The more he searched, the clearer it became that this practice had no foundation in apostolic teachings. It was a purely human invention, created to feed institutional greed. Other reformers began to express similar concerns in different parts of Europe. Erasmus of Rotterdam, John Colet in England, and various theologians and universities began to question not only indulgences, but the entire system of corruption that had infected the Roman Church. In 1517, Tetzel arrived dangerously close to Wittenberg with his most ambitious sales campaign. The Dominican friar had received direct orders from Leo X to maximize collection in the region, as the costs of St. Peter's Basilica were escalating uncontrollably. His commercial aggressiveness reached unprecedented levels. Luther's parishioners began to cross the border to buy indulgences from Tetzel, returning with certificates that supposedly freed them from the need for genuine confession and penance. Some even went so far as to confess sins they planned to commit, believing their prepaid indulgences covered them in advance. The last straw came when Luther discovered that one of his parishioners had bought a special indulgence that allegedly forgave him for a murder that he was planning to commit. The commercialization of faith had descended to such a low level that it had become a prior license for future crimes. On the night of October 30, 1517, Luther worked feverishly in his office, drafting a list of points that directly questioned the papal authority to sell salvation. His hands trembled not from fear, but from righteous indignation against the prostitution of everything he considered sacred. The next day, October 31st, Luther posted his famous 95 Theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The seemingly simple act would unleash an avalanche that would shake the foundations of Western Christianity and cost Rome millions of souls and incalculable fortunes. Luther's theses were like direct projectiles against the financial heart of the Vatican. The first questioned the very authority of the Pope to remit guilt that only God could forgive. The 27th, while Rome tried to stifle the indulgence scandal, Martin Luther was far from backing down. His 95 Theses spread through Germany like fire on dry straw, copied in universities, churches, and public squares. What began as an academic debate about questionable practices had become a resistance movement against papal authority. Luther realized he had touched an open wound in Christendom. The popular reaction to his criticism surprised even the reformer himself. Peasants, merchants, nobles, and clergy identified with his denunciations against the sale of divine forgiveness. The idea that salvation could be bought with coins sounded blasphemous to many sincere Christians. Luther had given voice to a sentiment that had been fermenting for decades in the Germanic communities, where money constantly flowed to Rome. Johann Tetzel, realizing that his sales campaign was threatened, tried to respond to the accusations with his own theses defending indulgences. But his words sounded empty in the face of the strength of Luther's theological arguments. The Dominican insisted that questioning indulgences was questioning the Pope himself, but this strategy only strengthened the perception that Rome was more interested in profit than in truth. The tension escalated when Luther published more detailed explanations of his theses, using the newly invented printing press to reach an even larger audience. His writings circulated in German, not just Latin, making his ideas accessible to the common people. Rome began to realize that it was not dealing with just another rebellious theologian, but with the revolution that threatened the entire power structure of the Church. The confrontation between Luther and the papal machine was just beginning, but it was already evident that indulgences had become the tinderbox for something much bigger. Western Christianity was about to fragment irreversibly. The Vatican could not remain silent while its most profitable practices were publicly attacked. Pope Leo X, initially underestimating the gravity of the situation, began to realize that Luther represented a real threat to papal authority. In 1518, the pontiff summoned the German reformer to retract his statements, but Luther categorically refused to back down from his convictions. The Roman strategy involved multiple fronts of attack. Theologians loyal to the Pope were mobilized to refute Luther's theses, arguing that questioning indulgences was equivalent to denying the power of the keys given by Christ to Peter. Simultaneously, political pressure was exerted on the German princes, warning them about the dangers of heresy in their territories. Rome knew that without secular support, even the best theological ideas would not survive. The situation became complicated when Luther, in public debates, began to question not only indulgences, but the papal infallibility itself. In Leipzig, during a famous debate with John Eck, Luther declared that church councils could and that only the scriptures were authority final in matters of faith. This statement represented a direct challenge to the hierarchical system that had sustained Roman power for over 1,000 years. Johann Tetzel, seeing his reputation and business ruined, intensified his personal attacks against Luther, even publicly burning the reformer's writings. But these dramatic demonstrations only strengthened the perception that Rome was desperate to silence critical voices. The indulgence salesman had become a symbol of the corruption that Luther denounced. The theological war was declared, and indulgences had become the battlefield where the destiny of Christendom would be decided. The Holy Roman Empire became a cauldron of religious and political tensions. Charles V, the young emperor, found himself in an impossible position. As the defender of the Catholic faith, he should condemn Luther, but as a German ruler, he could not ignore the popular support the reformer received. Indulgences had created a crisis that transcended purely theological issues, touching deep national wounds about Roman exploitation. German princes began to divide into opposing camps. Some saw in Luther an opportunity to reduce Roman influence in their territories, while others feared the consequences of challenging a millennial authority. The money from indulgences, which constantly flowed from Germany to Rome, had become a symbol of what many considered religious colonization. The issue was not just about salvation, but about national sovereignty. In 1521, Charles V convened the Diet of Worms, an assembly where Luther would be directly confronted with his statements. The reformer appeared knowing he could be executed as a heretic, but his courage impressed even his opponents. When urged to recant, Luther uttered words that would echo through history. He could not go against his conscience, for it would be dangerous and wrong to do anything contrary to the scriptures. Johann Tetzel, although not present in Worms, had become a symbolic figure of the old order being questioned. His aggressive sales techniques and his extravagant promises about the power of indulgences were constantly cited as examples of the corruption that needed to be reformed. The Dominican had involuntarily become the face of the crisis that shook Christendom. The division of the empire was inevitable, and Indulgences had been the spark that ignited a religious fire that would last for centuries. Luther's condemnation at Worms did not silence the reform movement. On the contrary, it radicalized it. Protected by Prince Frederick of Saxony, Luther continued developing his theological ideas, translating the Bible into German and establishing the foundations of what would become Protestantism. Indulgences had been only the beginning. Now, the entire sacramental and hierarchical structure of the Roman Church was questioned. The doctrine of justification by faith alone, which Luther developed in response to the indulgence scandal, revolutionized the Christian concept of salvation. If salvation depended exclusively on divine grace and personal faith, then the entire structure of clerical mediation, including the sale of forgiveness, lost its theological basis. Johann Tetzel had inadvertently contributed to the formulation of one of the central doctrines of Protestantism. Other reformers joined the movement, each bringing their own interpretations and emphases. John Calvin in Geneva, Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich, and later other leaders spread the Reformed ideas throughout Europe. What started as a German criticism of papal indulgences had become an international movement that would permanently fragment Western Christianity. Gutenberg's printing press became a crucial ally of the reformers. Pamphlets, treatises, and biblical translations circulated rapidly, spreading the new theological ideas beyond German borders. Rome could not control the dissemination of information as it had for centuries. The Catholic monopoly on Christian interpretation was irretrievably broken. The seeds planted by the controversial sale of indulgences had germinated into a new form of Christianity that would forever challenge Roman supremacy. Facing the growing Protestant threat, Rome finally recognized the need for internal reforms. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545, represented the Catholic response to the criticisms raised by Luther about indulgences and other questionable practices. Ironically, many of the denunciations made by the German reformer were partially acknowledged, and measures were taken to correct the most blatant abuses in the sale of pardons. The Council reaffirmed the theological validity of indulgences, but established strict regulations to prevent the abuses that had scandalized the faithful. The direct sale of indulgences was prohibited, although voluntary contributions were still accepted. Johann Tetzel and his aggressive commercial methods became examples of what should not be repeated in Reformed Catholic practice. The Catholic Church also invested heavily in the education of its clergy, establishing seminaries and improving the theological training of priests. The excesses that allowed figures like Tetzel to operate with such freedom were identified and corrected. The Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, became a crucial instrument in the reconquest of territories lost to Protestantism. Simultaneously, the Inquisition was strengthened to combat the dissemination of Protestant ideas. Books were burned, heretics were persecuted, and religious freedom of expression was severely restricted in territories that remained Catholic. Rome had learned that it could no longer ignore legitimate criticisms, but it would also not allow open challenges to its authority. The Counter-Reformation represented a renewed, but also more rigid, Catholic Church, molded in large part by the crisis initiated by the controversial sale of indulgences. The famous indulgence salesman did not escape the consequences of the revolution he had involuntarily helped unleash. Johann Tetzel saw his career and reputation destroyed by the scandal his practices provoked. The Dominican, who had once been celebrated as an efficient fundraiser for Rome, became a symbol of the corruption that the reformers denounced. His last years were marked by humiliation and ostracism. When Luther's criticisms gained force, Tetzel tried desperately to defend his practices through theological debates and apologetic writings, but his attempts to justify the sale of indulgences sounded increasingly empty in the face of the growing awakening of Christian conscience. The German people, who had previously paid their coins without questioning, now saw in his sales techniques a disrespect for the dignity of faith. The University of Frankfurt even publicly burned Tetzel's writings, a devastating public humiliation for someone who considered himself a respectable theologian. The Dominican, accustomed to the applause and financial success of his campaigns, found himself isolated and rejected even by some of his former allies in the Catholic hierarchy. In his final months of life, Tetzel received a conciliatory letter from Luther, who, despite all the disagreements, recognized that the indulgence seller had been merely an instrument of a corrupted system. The German reformer understood that responsibility for the abuses went far beyond a single individual, no matter how questionable his practices were. Johann Tetzel died in 1519, just 2 years after Luther posted his 95 Theses, carrying the burden of having been the catalyst for a crisis that shook all of Christendom. What began as a theological dispute over indulgences evolved into armed conflicts that would devastate Europe for more than a century. The religious tensions initiated by Luther's controversy against the practices of Johann Tetzel turned into wars that would redefine the European political and religious map. Protestant and Catholic princes took up arms, using doctrinal differences to justify territorial and political ambitions. The Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 was one of the first conflicts directly influenced by the Reform ideas. Although Luther condemned the violence of the rebels, many peasants were inspired by his criticisms of established authority to question not only the church, but the entire social structure. Indulgences had been the initial symbol of exploitation, but the revolt expanded against all forms of oppression. The Huguenot Wars in France, the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, and finally, the devastating 30 Years' War transformed theological issues into bloody international conflicts. What Johann Tetzel could never have imagined was that his sermons about indulgences would contribute to unleashing wars that would kill millions of people and leave vast regions of Europe in ruins. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 established the principle that each prince could choose the religion of his territory, consolidating the religious division of Europe. Papal indulgences, which once unified Western Christendom under Rome, had become the symbol of an irreversible rupture that would forever fragment European religious unity. The battlefields were soaked with bloodshed over disputes that began with the simple question, can divine forgiveness be bought? 5 centuries after the controversial sale of indulgences by Johann Tetzel, Christianity remains profoundly marked by the events unleashed in 1517. The current global religious landscape with its hundreds of Protestant denominations, the Reformed Catholic Church, and complex interreligious relations can be directly traced back to that crucial moment when Luther publicly questioned the papal practices of selling forgiveness. The modern concept of religious freedom has its roots in the historical need to accommodate different Christian interpretations that emerged after the Reformation. Religious tolerance, today considered fundamental in democratic societies, developed largely as a practical response to the religious wars initiated by the indulgence controversy. Societies learned that peaceful coexistence required accepting doctrinal differences. The Catholic Church itself was permanently transformed by the events initiated by Tetzel and Luther. The Second Vatican Council in the 20th century incorporated many reforms that echo criticisms originally raised by the Protestants. The direct sale of indulgences disappeared, lay participation increased, and financial transparency improved significantly. The consequences of the papal indulgences echoed far beyond the walls of Wittenberg. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in October 1517, he did not imagine he was unleashing a religious revolution that would split Western Christianity in half. The sale of forgiveness by Johann Tetzel had become the trigger for deep questions about papal authority and the nature of salvation. The indulgence scandal revealed structural fractures in the Catholic Church that had been accumulating for centuries. Systematic corruption, rampant nepotism, and the commodification of faith had undermined Rome's institutional credibility. When simple people like the German peasant Anna discovered that their coins did not buy celestial passports, the popular revolt gained unstoppable force. What began as a protest against financial abuses transformed into a fundamental theological questioning. The Protestant Reformation was born directly from the ashes of the indulgence scandal. Entire countries rejected papal authority, creating independent national churches. Henry V's England, the German principalities, Calvin's Switzerland and the Scandinavian countries embraced reformed versions of Christianity. The religious map of Europe was permanently redrawn, creating divisions that persist to this day. Economically, the consequences were equally devastating for Rome. The loss of Protestant territories meant the interruption of massive financial flows that sustained the Vatican. Indulgences, out of once a source of abundant revenue, became a symbol of papal corruption. Even in remaining Catholic territories, popular distrust forced internal reforms and greater transparency in ecclesiastical practices. The Christian world would never be the same after the scandal initiated by the papal sale of paradise. Centralized religious authority gave way to confessional pluralism, while theological questioning paved the way for modern critical thinking. Anna, our German peasant, had witnessed the beginning of a completely new era in the history of Christianity, where individual faith would definitively supplant institutional mediation bought with coins. Today, more than 500 years after the papal indulgence scandal, the lessons of this lucrative heresy continue relevant for understanding the dangers of institutional religious corruption. The story of how popes literally sold paradise serves as an eternal warning about the risks of the commodification of faith. When spiritual leaders transform salvation into a marketable commodity, they not only betray their followers, but undermine the foundations of religion itself. The impact of indulgences largely transcended the religious sphere, influencing the development of modern capitalism, educational reform, and scientific thought. The break with absolute papal authority created space for questions that extended beyond theology. The critical method applied by reformers like Luther to ecclesiastical documents subsequently influenced the development of modern historical research and the experimental scientific method. Anna, our German peasant, represented millions of common people who painfully discovered that their faith had been commercially exploited by supposedly sacred authorities. Her disillusionment with the indulgences purchased for her deceased husband symbolizes the awakening of individual conscience against institutional manipulation. This transformation of collective mentality contributed significantly to the emergence of modern democratic values and individual rights. The questionable practices related to indulgences forced the Catholic Church itself to undertake deep internal reforms during the Council of Trent. Although it maintained the doctrine of indulgences, the Church established stricter regulations to prevent blatant commercial abuses. These changes demonstrate how religious scandals can paradoxically strengthen institutions through necessary reforms and greater accountability. The heresy of papal indulgences teaches us that no religious authority is above moral accountability. When spiritual leaders prioritize material gains over the spiritual well-being of their followers, they inevitably destroy the trust that sustains any legitimate religious institution. The history of Anna and millions like her remains as eternal testimony that authentic faith cannot be bought, sold, or manipulated by commercial interests, regardless of how powerful the authorities involved may be.